Dust motes danced in the stifling heat of the parlor. A heavy porcelain thud echoed, followed by a sharp, fragile whimper. Simone wiped a speck of spit from her manicured thumb. In the hallway, a girl holding a silver tray realized she was about to make a fatal mistake. Bridget's knees ached. The damp terrycloth towel in her hands was turning a sickly gray as she dragged it along the mahogany baseboards of the Conti estate. The house smelled intensely of lemon ammonia, fighting a losing battle against the underlying scent of old money, a stale, suffocating mix of cedarwood, trapped cigar smoke, and dry rot. She paused, sitting back on her heels. Her spine popped. She didn't like this house. She didn't like the people in it. She was here for the envelope of cash handed to her every second Friday by a man with no neck and knuckles like crushed walnuts. Bridget was 22, entirely alone, and surviving on day-old bread and spite. She wasn't the type to care about the moral failings of her employers. If they wanted to shoot each other in the basement, that was their business. So long as the mess didn't ruin the Persian rugs, she had to vacuum. Then there was Katerina. Katerina was Vincent's mother. Vincent Conti ran the docks, the local unions, and whatever else moved in the shadows of the city. He was a man of few words, heavy footsteps, and a stare that made the air feel suddenly thin. But Katerina was just an old woman trapped in a mind that was slowly dissolving. She smelled of powdery lavender and, occasionally, the faint, sour tang of incontinence. She spent her days in a wheelchair near the solarium window, picking at the loose threads of a crocheted blanket. Bridget liked Katerina, not out of some grand, saintly compassion, but because the old woman was the only quiet thing in this house. Sometimes Bridget would pocket a stray quarter or a silver teaspoon, and Katerina would just watch her with milky, uncomprehending eyes, offering a gummy smile. The heavy thud of stilettos on the hardwood floor snapped Bridget out of her thoughts. Simone. Simone was Vincent's fiancée. She was a jagged piece of glass, dressed in silk. Today, she wore a white linen dress that looked too stiff to sit in. Her perfume, something cloying, synthetic, and violently floral, hit Bridget's nose a full 3 seconds before Simone rounded the corner.
"You missed a spot," Simone said. Her voice was flat, bored. She didn't look at Bridget. She looked at a smudge on the baseboard near the grandfather clock.
Bridget swallowed the copper taste of resentment. "Yes, ma'am." She crawled forward, scrubbing at the invisible mark. Simone stepped over her, the hem of her dress brushing Bridget's sweaty neck. Bridget flinched, repulsed by the contact. Simone walked into the solarium. Bridget squeezed the filthy rag into her bucket. The dirty water swirled, opaque and gray. From the other room, the television murmured. Then, the volume cut out. "Stop doing that." Simone's voice drifted out, sharper now. The polite veneer was gone, replaced by a grating hiss. Katerina mumbled something unintelligible, a soft, rhythmic humming. "I said stop," Simone snapped. "You're ruining the blanket. God, you are so disgusting. Look at your mouth. You've got pudding on your chin like a feral animal." Bridget stayed frozen on her knees. Her hands gripped the plastic rim of the bucket. Her pulse thumped a heavy, irregular beat against her ribs. "Don't get involved," she told herself. "It's not your business. Look at the floor. Scrub the wood." There was a sharp slap, flesh on flesh. It wasn't a movie sound. It wasn't loud or echoing. It was dull, wet, and final. Katerina let out a small, broken gasp, like a dog whose tail had been stepped on. Bridget's stomach turned over, acidic and hot. She closed her eyes. Her fingers dug into the edge of the bucket so hard her fingernails bent backwards. She hated this. She hated Simone. She hated the mafia. She hated the heat in the room. But most of all, she hated herself, because she knew with sickening certainty that she wasn't going to stay on her knees. The kitchen was a sauna. Bridget pushed through the swinging doors, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The industrial stove was radiating heat. She grabbed the first thing she saw on the counter, a heavy, cast-iron tea kettle resting on an unlit burner. It was still warm from the morning. She didn't think about the logistics. She didn't have a plan. Her mind was a static hiss of adrenaline and bile. She walked back down the hallway. The squeak of her rubber-soled shoes seemed deafening. The smell of the lemon ammonia stung her eyes, mixing with the sweat dripping down her temples. When she reached the threshold of the solarium, she stopped. Simone was leaning over Katerina's wheelchair. Her manicured hands, nails painted a glossy, predatory red, were gripping the old woman's frail forearms. Katerina was crying, thick tears rolling into the deep creases of her face. "Vincent isn't here to coddle you today," Simone whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying, ecstatic rage. "He's tired of you. I'm tired of you. You smell like an open grave." She twisted Katerina's left arm. The old woman shrieked, a reedy, rattling sound. Bridget didn't yell to announce herself. She didn't say something sharp and heroic. Her hands were shaking violently. She took 2 steps forward, raised the cast-iron kettle and swung it downward. She didn't aim for the head. She wasn't a killer. She aimed for the shoulder. The heavy iron connected with the delicate porcelain curve of Simone's collarbone. The sound was nauseating, a hollow crunch of bone, yielding to dense metal. Simone didn't scream immediately. The impact knocked the wind out of her. She stumbled sideways, her white linen dress tangling around her legs, and hit the edge of the glass coffee table before collapsing onto the Persian rug. The kettle slipped from Bridget's sweaty grip and hit the floor with a deafening metallic clang. Warm, leftover tea splashed across the silk threads of the carpet, staining it the color of dirty rust. Then, Simone screamed. It was a jagged, ear-piercing wail. She clutched her shoulder, her face twisted in a mask of sheer agony. The crisp, white linen of her dress was now smeared with dirt from the floor and small splashes of amber tea. Bridget stood there, panting, the adrenaline instantly draining from her system, replaced by a cold, leaden terror. What had she done? The static in her ears faded, and the reality of the room snapped into hyperfocus. The texture of the damp rag still tucked in her apron, the smell of Simone's shattered perfume bottle, which had been knocked off the table, the sight of the broken woman on the floor. Katerina was rocking back and forth in her wheelchair, hands covering her ears, humming louder now to drown out the noise. "You're dead," Bridget thought. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with a heavy, sinking resignation. You are going to end up in a landfill. Simone gasped for air, her eyes wide, locked on Bridget. You fucking bitch," she wheezed, spit flying from her lips. "I'll kill you. Vincent will cut your skin off." Bridget backed up slowly. Her foot hit the discarded kettle. She tripped, catching herself on the doorframe. She needed to run. If she made it to the kitchen, out the back door, down the alley. A shadow fell over the entryway. Bridget froze, her fingers gripping the wooden molding of the frame. The smell hit her first. Expensive cologne, masking the metallic scent of exhaust and stale tobacco. Vincent Conti stood in the doorway. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit, the jacket unbuttoned, his tie was loosened. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly exhausted. There were deep violet shadows beneath his eyes. His gaze swept the room, entirely devoid of the shock Bridget expected. He looked at the crushed kettle. He looked at the spilled tea. He looked at Simone writhing on the floor, weeping and clutching her mangled collarbone. Finally, his eyes settled on Bridget. Her lungs stopped working. She waited for him to reach into his jacket. She waited for the cold glint of steel. Instead, Vincent stepped into the room, his leather shoes crunching softly on a piece of broken glass from the perfume bottle. The silence stretching between them was agonizing. Simone's sobs were the only sound, wet and frantic. "Vincent!" Simone shrieked, her voice cracking. "Vincent! She attacked me! The maid! She tried to kill me!" She dragged herself backward away from Bridget, her pristine white dress completely ruined, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and tears. Vincent didn't rush to her side. He didn't drop to his knees to comfort his bleeding fiancée. He simply unbuttoned his cuffs and slowly rolled them up, exposing thick, hairy forearms scarred from old, violent mistakes. I see that, Vincent said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. He walked past Bridget, standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the blow. It didn't come. Vincent walked over to his mother. Katerina was still rocking, her frail chest heaving. Vincent knelt in front of her wheelchair. He ignored Simone completely. "Mama," he said softly. Katerina blinked, her cloudy eyes slowly focusing on his face. She reached out with a trembling hand. Vincent caught her wrist. Bridget opened her eyes and watched. The harsh afternoon sunlight filtering through the solarium windows illuminated the scene with a cruel clarity. Vincent's thumb brushed over the skin of Katerina's forearm. There, blooming against the fragile, translucent skin, were angry, purple, finger-shaped bruises. They were fresh. They were the exact size and shape of Simone's manicured grip. Vincent's jaw tightened. A muscle leaped beneath the skin of his cheek. It was the only micro-expression he allowed himself, but it changed the temperature of the room entirely. The oxygen seemed to ignite, then freeze. He gently placed Katerina's hand back in her lap. He stood up and turned around. Simone had stopped screaming. Her survival instinct, honed by years of navigating the vicious circles of their world, finally kicked in. She saw what Vincent was looking at. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale and sickly under her expensive foundation. Vincent, she was having an episode, Simone stammered, her voice trembling. She fell. I was trying to hold her up. I was trying to protect her. Vincent slowly walked toward Simone. The crunch of glass under his shoes was rhythmic, deliberate. You were trying to protect her, he repeated. The words tasted like ash. Yes! And then this. This feral bitch came out of nowhere with a pot. Simone pointed a trembling, red-nailed finger at Bridget. She's insane, Vincent. Shoot her. Call your men. Shoot her right now. Vincent stopped a few feet from Simone. He looked down at her. Then he looked over his shoulder at Bridget. Bridget was backed into the corner, hugging her arms across her chest. She felt nauseous. Her uniform was stuck to her skin with cold sweat. She wasn't a hero anymore. She was just a girl who couldn't afford rent, trapped in a room with monsters. Did she fall? Vincent asked Bridget. Bridget's throat was dry. She tried to speak, but her vocal cords seized. She swallowed hard. No, the word cracked, pathetic, and small. She cleared her throat and tried again, anger momentarily overriding her terror. She slapped her. Then she grabbed her arms and twisted them. You lying whore, Simone screamed, trying to scramble backward, but her injured shoulder gave out, and she collapsed with a fresh cry of pain. Vincent didn't yell. He didn't strike Simone. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. He dialed a number, holding the phone to his ear. The silence in the room stretched out again, suffocating and thick. Rocco, Vincent said quietly into the phone, bring the car around to the front. We need to take Simone to the hospital. Simone let out a sobbing breath of relief. Thank God. Vincent, baby, it hurts so much. And Rocco, Vincent interrupted, talking over her. He didn't look at Simone. His dead, dark eyes were fixed on the stain on the Persian rug. Call her brother. Tell him the engagement is off. Tell him if I ever see her inside the city limits again, I'll send her back to him in a jar. Simone froze. The air left her lungs in a hollow rush. Vincent, no, you can't. Vincent hung up the phone and dropped it back into his pocket. He turned his back on Simone, discarding her existence as easily as one might toss away a burnt match. He walked over to Bridget. Bridget pressed her back so hard against the wall she felt the plaster dust rub onto her apron. He towered over her. Up close, the scars on his face were prominent. A jagged white line cutting through his left eyebrow, a slight indentation on his jaw. He smelled intensely of that dark cologne and exhaustion. He reached out. Bridget flinched violently, raising her hands to shield her face. Vincent's hand paused in the air. Slowly, deliberately, he reached past her face and plucked the damp, filthy terry cloth rag from the pocket of her apron. He tossed it onto the coffee table. "You swing a kettle like a dock worker," he murmured, his voice so quiet only she could hear it. Bridget kept her arms up, trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, a tear finally escaping, hot and shameful, cutting a clean track through the dust on her cheek. "I didn't. I just couldn't watch it." Vincent stared down at her. For a fraction of a second, the deadness in his eyes shifted, replaced by something entirely unreadable, a crack in the stone. "Go to the kitchen," he said, his tone flat again. "Wash your hands. You have scraped your knuckles." Bridget looked down. He was right. In the impact, she had scraped her own knuckles against the iron handle. It was stinging, a dull throb that she hadn't even registered. She scrambled past him, nearly tripping over her own feet to escape the room. As she pushed through the swinging doors into the relative safety of the sweltering kitchen, she heard the front door open and heavy footsteps entering the hallway. Rocco had arrived. Bridget turned on the tap in the industrial sink. The water ran cold, splashing against the stainless steel basin. She plunged her hands under the stream, watching the faint dirt trails wash down the drain. She stared at her own reflection in the metal backsplash, pale, hollow-eyed hair plastered to her forehead. She hadn't been killed, not yet, anyway. But as she stood shivering in the oppressive heat of the kitchen, listening to the muffled sounds of Simone being dragged out of the house, Bridget knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was no longer just the invisible girl who scrubbed the floors. She had crossed a line, stepping out of the wallpaper and into the breathing reality of Vincent Conti's world. And the most terrifying part wasn't what he might do to her. The most terrifying part was the way he had looked at her when he realized she wasn't afraid to hit back. The following Friday, Bridget expected a bullet. At the very least, she expected the heavy, windowless doors of a black Lincoln Town car and a one-way trip to the salt marshes outside city limits. Instead, she got an envelope. Rocco handed it to her in the kitchen. He was a massive man, built like a brick wall in a cheap wool suit. He smelled of peppermint gum and stale nicotine. He didn't hand it to her with a smile or a threat. He just dropped the thick manila package on the stainless steel prep counter beside the onions she was supposed to be dicing. "Count it," Rocco grunted, chewing lazily. Bridget wiped her hands on her apron, her knuckles, still faintly yellow with healing bruises from the cast-iron kettle, ached in the damp morning air. She pulled back the flap. The stack of bills was easily an inch thick. Hundreds, crisp, uncirculated, smelling sharply of ink and mint. It was more money than she had made in the last 2 years combined. She felt a sudden, violent urge to vomit. It wasn't lottery money. It was blood money. It was hush money. "I don't," Bridget started, her voice cracking. She pushed the envelope a fraction of an inch across the metal counter. "I didn't ask for a payoff." "It ain't a payoff, kid," Rocco said. He checked his watch, a heavy silver thing that pinched the thick hair on his wrist. "It's your first week's advance. You don't scrub floors no more. You're on the 3rd floor now, with the old lady." Bridget stared at him. The refrigerator motor hummed loudly in the silence. "She won't let the nurses touch her," Rocco continued, indifferent to Bridget's rising panic. "She bit the last one, drew blood, but she likes you, so you live here now. South wing, first door past the linen closet. Pack whatever you got in that shithole apartment you rent. A car is coming for you at 3. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out, his heavy boots scuffing the linoleum. Bridget looked down at the money. She thought about running. She could take the cash, buy a bus ticket to Nebraska, disappear. But she knew how men like Vincent Conti operated. The money wasn't a gift. It was a leash. If she ran, they would find her. The only way out was through. Moving into the Conti estate was like stepping into a mausoleum where the occupants hadn't realized they were dead yet. Her room was small but suffocatingly opulent, with heavy velvet drapes that smelled of dust and a mattress so soft it made her spine ache. Her days shifted into a strange, intimate rhythm. The harsh smell of lemon ammonia was replaced by the powdery scent of Katerina's lavender talc, the sharp sting of rubbing alcohol, and the metallic tang of nutritional supplements. Katerina was quieter now. The bruises on her arms had faded to a sickly yellowish green, but the psychological mark remained. She flinched at sudden shadows. Bridget didn't coddle her. She didn't have the maternal warmth of a registered nurse. Instead, she treated Katerina with a blunt, cynical pragmatism that the old woman seemed to respect. When Katerina refused to eat her oatmeal, Bridget didn't coax her with airplanes. She sat in the chair opposite her, ate a spoonful herself, and said, "If you don't eat this, they're going to put a tube up your nose, Katerina. I don't want to look at that, and you don't want to feel it." Katerina would glare, gummy and obstinate before snatching the spoon. Vincent was a ghost in his own home. Bridget rarely saw him in the daylight. He existed in the periphery, a heavy footstep on the floorboards above, a trail of cigarette smoke lingering in the hallway, a low, rumbling voice behind the closed mahogany doors of his study. The house felt emptier without Simone, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It felt like the drop in barometric pressure right before a thunderstorm. Simone's family, the Morettis, ran the East Side rackets. You didn't break an engagement with a Moretti by breaking the bride's collarbone and sending her home in the back of a sedan. Everyone in the house was waiting for the retaliation. It happened on a Tuesday night. Bridget couldn't sleep. The velvet drapes trapped the heat in her room, making the air thick and unbreathable. She wore an oversized, faded gray t-shirt and cotton shorts, padding barefoot down the grand staircase toward the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was pitch black, save for the weak moonlight slicing through the tall windows. As she pushed the swinging door to the kitchen, she froze. The refrigerator door was open, casting a pale, yellow square of light across the terracotta tiles. Vincent was standing there. He was out of his suit, wearing only dark slacks and a white undershirt that clung to his broad chest. He held a bottle of cold water against the back of his neck. He didn't jump when the door squeaked. He didn't even turn around. "You walk too softly," Vincent said. His voice was gravelly, scraped raw by too many cigars and too little sleep. In a house like this, people who sneak up on people get shot. Bridget's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird rhythm. "I wasn't sneaking. I was getting water." Vincent shut the refrigerator. The kitchen plunged back into darkness, lit only by the ambient glow of the city through the window over the sink. He turned to face her. In the shadows, the jagged scar through his eyebrow looked deeper, darker. He didn't leave. He leaned against the counter, unscrewing the plastic cap of the water bottle. She ate all her dinner today. It wasn't a question, but Bridget nodded anyway, remembering he couldn't see her well. "Yes, mostly." She spit out the peas. A sharp exhale of air through his nose. A laugh, almost. "She hates peas. Always has." Bridget wrapped her arms around her waist, intensely aware of her bare legs, her cheap, worn-out clothing in the presence of a man whose suits cost more than her life was worth. "I'll remember that." She moved toward the cabinet to get a glass. She had to walk past him. The space was wide enough, but the sheer gravity of the man made it feel like a tightrope. As she reached up, the fabric of her shirt rode up slightly. "Why did you do it?" Vincent's voice stopped her, her hand hovering inches from a glass tumbler. "Do what?" Bridget asked, her throat tight. "Swing the kettle." Vincent took a slow drink of water. The sound of him swallowing was loud in the quiet room. "You were a maid. You were invisible. You got paid under the table. If you walked out the back door, Simone wouldn't have even remembered your face. You risked your life for an old woman who barely knows her own name." Bridget lowered her hand. The glass stayed in the cabinet. She turned to look at him. She was tired. The bone-deep exhaustion of poverty and constant anxiety flared up, temporarily overriding her fear of him. "Because she was helpless," Bridget said, her voice flat, devoid of any heroic inflection. "And because I know what it feels like to have someone twist your arm just because they know no one is coming to stop them." Vincent went perfectly still. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, smelling faintly of ozone and impending rain. He didn't ask her who had twisted her arm. He didn't offer cheap sympathy. Men like Vincent didn't deal in pity, they dealt in leverage. But in that moment, Bridget felt a strange, terrifying shift. He wasn't looking at her as an employee anymore. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a locked safe, trying to figure out the combination. He set the water bottle on the counter. "Go to sleep, Bridget." He used her name. It was the first time she had heard it in his mouth. It sounded heavy. As he walked past her toward the door, the heat radiating off his skin brushed against her shoulder. Bridget stayed in the dark kitchen for a long time, the hairs on her arms standing straight up, long after the sound of his footsteps had faded upstairs. The humidity that had choked the estate for a week finally broke on a Thursday afternoon. It didn't fade, it shattered. A violent summer storm rolled off the coast, turning the manicured lawns into a flooded, muddy swamp. Inside the solarium, the air was suddenly cool, carrying the faint metallic scent of ozone through the ventilation grates. Bridget sat on a low velvet stool beside Katerina's wheelchair. The old woman was asleep, her chin resting on her chest, a half-finished cup of chamomile tea cooling on the side table. The rain hit the floor-to-ceiling windows with the force of a pressure washer, a relentless drumming that drowned out the low murmur of the television in the adjoining room. Bridget liked the noise. It was a barrier. It made the massive, suffocating house feel small and contained. She was holding a heavy pair of brass tailoring shears, working a frayed edge off a piece of heavy upholstery fabric she'd been using to patch a tear in the sofa. The shears weighed nearly a pound, their brass loops cold against her calloused knuckles. The heavy wooden doors at the front of the estate were shut tight. Rocco and the rest of Vincent's men were supposedly in the basement, taking inventory of a new shipment. The main floor was empty. Then, the perimeter alarms failed. Bridget didn't hear a siren. She only noticed because the small green light on the wall panel by the doorway blinked out, plunging the keypad into darkness. A fraction of a second later, a shadow detached itself from the row of soaking wet hydrangeas outside the glass. Bridget stopped cutting. The shears hung open in her hand. 2 men. They wore dark, heavy rain slickers, the hoods pulled low. They didn't move like gardeners caught in the storm. They moved with a predatory, hurried efficiency. One of them carried something long and wrapped in a black plastic garbage bag. A shotgun. The retaliation. Simone's family had finally made their move. Panic, cold and sharp as a razor, sliced through Bridget's stomach. She didn't scream. Screaming was a waste of oxygen. She dropped the fabric, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood. She grabbed the handles of Katerina's wheelchair. "Katerina," Bridget hissed, shaking the chair. "Wake up. We have to move." The old woman startled, blinking rapidly, disoriented by the sudden jolt. Bridget didn't wait for her to understand. She yanked the chair backward, dragging it away from the exposed wall of windows and toward the thick stone planter in the center of the room. The glass shattered before she made it halfway. It wasn't a clean break. The window caved inward with an explosive crunch. A rush of freezing wind and rainwater blasted into the solarium, soaking Bridget's clothes instantly. The Persian rug was covered in shards of jagged glass. The first man stepped through the ruined frame. His boots crunched heavily on the debris. He smelled intensely of wet wool, sweat, and gun oil. He pulled a suppressed pistol from beneath his slicker. It looked unnervingly small, a heavy black cylinder attached to a compact frame. "Conti!" the man yelled, his voice muffled by the pouring rain. Bridget shoved Katerina's wheelchair behind the stone planter. She crouched down, her knees pressing into the wet floorboards, her heart hammering a frantic, sickening rhythm against her ribs. She looked around desperately. The door to the hallway was 20 feet away. She would never make it. The man took another step into the room. Water dripped from the brim of his hood. "Check the parlor," he muttered to the second man, stepping through the window. Bridget's hand brushed against the floor. Her fingers wrapped around the cold loops of the brass tailoring shears she had dropped. She wasn't a killer. She was a maid. She survived by keeping her head down and scrubbing baseboards. But as she listened to the heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching the planter, a primal, violent instinct took over. If she stayed hidden, they would find her. They would shoot Katerina, and then they would shoot her. The first man rounded the planter. He saw the wheelchair. A grim, satisfied sneer pulled at his mouth. He raised the suppressed pistol, aiming directly at Katerina's trembling form. He didn't check his blind spot. Bridget surged upward from a crouch. Her muscles burned with adrenaline. She didn't think about technique. She drove her entire body weight forward, gripping the brass handles of the shears with both hands. She aimed for the gap between his collar and his hood. The heavy brass blades sank into the soft tissue of his neck. The resistance was horrifying, the dense pop of muscle and cartilage giving way under the sharp steel. The man's eyes bulged, wide and uncomprehending. A wet, choking gargle tore from his throat. The pistol slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. Hot, dark blood erupted from the wound, spraying across Bridget's hands and forearms. It felt shockingly warm against the freezing rain blowing into the room. Bridget ripped the shears backward. She fell onto the floor, slipping on the slick mixture of water and blood. The second man heard the noise. He turned, the shotgun raising. He saw his partner collapsing, clutching his ruined throat, and he saw Bridget on her hands and knees, gasping for air, holding a pair of dripping shears. He racked the shotgun. The mechanical clack echoed over the storm. Bridget couldn't move. Her lungs seized. She stared down the dark, hollow barrel of the weapon. The metallic smell of the blood on her hands was suffocating. She squeezed her eyes shut. The blast shook the floorboards, but the pain never came. Instead, something heavy and wet collapsed just a few feet away. The acrid chemical stench of cordite flooded the air, burning her nostrils. Bridget forced her eyes open. The second man was dead. The side of his head was gone, reduced to a grotesque splatter of crimson against the pale yellow wallpaper. He lay in a crumpled heap, the shotgun pinned beneath his body. In the doorway leading to the hallway stood Vincent Conti. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to expose the thick, scarred muscle of his forearms. He held a massive, matte black handgun. A thin wisp of gray smoke curled lazily from the barrel. His chest heaved once, heavily. He lowered the gun. He didn't look at the men he had just shot, nor the one bleeding out by the planter. He looked at Bridget. The room was silent, save for the rain lashing against the broken windows. Bridget was trembling so violently she couldn't push herself up. The adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow, leaving her nauseous and weak. The brass shears slipped from her slick, bloody fingers, clattering against a piece of broken glass. She had killed a man. The realization settled into her bones, heavy as lead. Vincent walked into the room. His leather shoes made a wet, sucking sound on the ruined floorboards. He bypassed his mother, whose eyes were squeezed shut as she hummed a frantic, desperate tune to block out the violence. He stopped in front of Bridget. He dropped to a crouch, ignoring the blood and rainwater soaking into his trousers. Up close, the violent reality of the man was overwhelming. The jagged scar through his eyebrow, the hard, flat set of his jaw. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a clean, white linen handkerchief. Bridget flinched, pulling her shoulders up to her ears. Vincent paused. Then, moving with a terrifying, deliberate slowness, he reached out. He didn't touch the shears. He wrapped his large, calloused hand around Bridget's shaking wrist. His grip was entirely steady. "Look at me," Vincent commanded, his voice a low, gravelly scrape that cut right through the panic clouding her mind. Bridget forced her head up. Her breath hitched. Vincent pressed the handkerchief to her cheek, wiping away a smear of arterial blood that had splashed across her jawline. The rough texture of the linen grounded her. He pressed harder, wiping the blood from her hands, finger by finger. "You stopped running," he murmured. The deadness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dark, possessive current that was infinitely more dangerous. "You could have run out the back door while they were coming through the window." "I couldn't," Bridget whispered, her voice cracking. The smell of the dead man beside her made her stomach heave. They were going to kill her. Vincent threw the bloody handkerchief onto the floor. He didn't let go of her wrist. His thumb brushed over the bruised, scraped knuckles she had earned hitting Simone a week ago. "They didn't," Vincent said. He tilted his head, studying her face, reading the lines of shock and raw survival etched into her features. "You kept what belongs to me breathing." He didn't say thank you. Men like Vincent didn't feel gratitude. They felt ownership. And as he held her there on the ruined floor of the solarium, surrounded by broken glass and the metallic reek of blood, Bridget knew the truth. She had traded one cage for another. But as she looked into the dark, unwavering stare of the boss of the Conti family, a terrifying thought crossed her mind. She didn't want the door to open anymore. The line between survivor and accomplice is measured in blood and silence. Bridget's choice proves that true power isn't about wearing a crown. It's about knowing when to strike. If this dark, gritty descent into the mafia underworld kept your heart pounding, smash that like button, share this video with someone who loves grounded storytelling, and subscribe to our channel for more intense, raw narratives.